Welcome to Around the Weird. Here's your host, the museum curator of the strange and unusual, Mr. Nothing.
Thank you, mysterious voice, and welcome back to Around the Weird, a booktube channel where I talk about all the unusual and out of the ordinary literature that I found in my travels. Today it is Poetry Thursday, so I wanted to talk about some poetry of interest as well as some poetry from LGBT writers, as it is that period of Pride where I'm talking about LGBT poets from the end of May until the end of July. Today is a bit of an interesting poem. It is all about world wars. Specifically, it is about living during a time of world wars. I am referring to I Lived in the First Century of World Wars by Muriel Rukeyser. For those who don't know, Muriel Rukeyser was a poet and a journalist who lived between the 1910s and 1980. She was mostly probably known for her journalism as she covered the Spanish Civil War of the 1930s, the Great Depression, World War II, and other such events, as well as the rise of the feminist movement. And she also wrote poetry about such things, just in general, talking about the state of the world, talking about feminism in her poetry, and focusing on again, the state of how things are, which led some people to say that her poetry was a bit sad, a bit pessimistic. But the critics also noted that her poetry had its optimistic moments too, which is pretty good. Although the poem that we're talking about today, I would say, is a bit more pessimistic. It is fascinating to look at her activist history and see how many things she was just on the right side of history on. She supported the Loyalists during the Spanish Civil War, which was opposite of the Francos, so she wasn't a fascist supporter there. And then she was on the side of the feminist movements as well. And unrelated to all of that, she was also bisexual, which is why we're talking about her here today. Pretty fascinating individual, and I'm happy that I found her poetry. So without further ado, let's talk about this poem. I will read it, do a little bit of analysis, and we will move on from there. I lived in the first century of world wars. I lived in the first century of world wars. Most mornings I would be more or less insane. The newspapers would arrive with their careless stories. The news would pour out of various devices interrupted by attempts to sell products to the unseen. I would call my friends on other devices. They would be more or less mad for similar reasons. Slowly I would get to pen and paper, make my poems for others unseen and unborn. In the day I would be reminded of those men and women, brave, setting up signals across vast distances, considering a nameless way of living, of almost unimagined values. As the lights darkened, as the lights of nights brightened, we would try to imagine them, try to find each other, to construct peace, to make love, to reconcile waking with sleeping, ourselves with each other, ourselves with ourselves. We would try by any means to reach the limit of ourselves, to reach beyond ourselves, to let go the means, to wake. I lived in the first century of these wars. In terms of analysis, there is a fair bit to talk about with this poem, I Lived in the First Century of World Wars. In terms of narrative, there isn't really a strict narrative in this poem. It's merely the narrator discussing what's going on in their time period and how hard it is to connect with one another, to be more than just within yourself, to connect with other people, make peace, find love, and live a fulfilling life that way. And how much of a challenge that is. And so a big theme of this poem is human connection. And one of the ways that Rukeyser goes about with this poem is sort of talking about the unseen, the people you can't connect with because you're not really in a position to connect with them. You see that early in the poem where she says the news would pour out of various devices, interrupted by attempts to sell products to the unseen. I would call my friends on other devices. They would be more or less mad for similar reasons. And then slowly I would get to pen and paper, make my poems for others unseen and unborn. So there she's saying she's writing for people in the future who are not yet born, but they're also unseen. She doesn't really know, like, she knows she has an audience, but she doesn't know who those people are. And then, like, the news is doing the news, but it's also doing ads and selling products to the unseen. You can't even see these people. Like, they're there, but you can't reach them, you can't feel them. They're all around, and it's very hard to connect, possibly because it's a century of wars. There's a lot of death, there's a lot of chaos, and not a lot of connection in that way. And you see this especially at the end of the poem, where the narrator says, "We would try to imagine them, try to find each other, to construct peace, to make love, to reconcile waking with sleeping, ourselves with each other, ourselves with ourselves. We would try by any means to reach the limit of ourselves, to reach beyond ourselves, to let go the means." So that's a really fascinating aspect of this poem, to say that you want to reach beyond yourself. You want to connect with other people. And it sounds like it's a very difficult process for the narrator, possibly for Rukeyser, that maybe things are too stressful, too burdensome at this time. Again, she's saying we're living in a century of wars. So, maybe things are pretty drastic and serious, and you can't really connect with those other people because of financial reasons, because of social reasons, for one reason or another. Again, talking about technology. And this was written in the 60s, it would seem. So, with the advent of technology, maybe she's saying that's making us more disconnected in a very interesting way, that it's making it hard for us to truly connect to one another. I would be interested in hearing what she would say with the advent of computers and cell phones and all sorts of things like that. It seems to be more than just, this technology is isolating us, like the old boomer mindset. It seems to be a genuine concern here. And what's also interesting is how she's framing all of this in the context of war. She's saying, "I lived in the first century of world wars." And at the end of the poem, she says, I lived in the first century of these wars. Which is interesting, like indicating that the need to connect, or the difficulty in connecting, is the real war. Although I would argue that the war against the fascist empires of World War II and, whatever happened in World War I, those were the real wars. But I can see how an inability to connect with others, especially at the time that she was writing of the American Civil Rights Movement and how stressful and hectic that was, war can mean more than that. It can mean a loss of ability to connect with one another, or seeing your neighbor get harmed and wanting to help but not really knowing what you can do about that. So really kind of sad aspect of this poem, kind of indicating that, human connection is very difficult, especially in modern times. So those are my thoughts on I Lived in the First Century of World Wars by Muriel Rukeyser. A pretty solid poem, one that is pretty sad, but I feel like it's definitely a strong attempt to connect with others, to let people know that I see you, you see me. We're trying to, do the humanity thing. We're trying to be one with another and like share a connection, and that might be hard to sometimes talk about. That might be hard to really get across at times, but Rukeyser is certainly trying. I definitely recommend that you read this. I'll put a link to it in the description. Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. Let's have a discussion about this. Otherwise, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe so that more people can find out about this poet or this poem if they don't already know. Otherwise, don't forget I already repeated that. Otherwise, I wish you the best of luck in your weird and world warish travels. Farewell.